The forest was unusually silent when Mark noticed a shape lying awkwardly beneath a ledge. At first, he thought it was debris from a landslide, but as he drew closer, the outline of spotted fur came into focus. A lynx was stretched on the forest floor, sides rising in shallow, uneven breaths. Her eyes were open, glassy yet focused enough to meet his. The sight hit him like a punch in the chest. Wild animals didn't stay still like this unless something was terribly wrong. Mark crouched a few feet away, careful not to startle her further. He could hear his own breathing loud in the quiet woods, so loud it seemed to echo back at him. The lynx's ears flicked weakly, one ear torn at the edge, fur tangled with pine needles and damp earth. Her whiskers twitched as if each breath was a struggle. Mark pulled his phone out, fingers trembling, and called the reserve's emergency number. Static crackled, and then a rough voice came through. Paul, the ranger, spoke firmly, telling him not to touch the animal. Stay by her head, watch her breathing. No loud sounds. Don't let anyone else come close, Paul instructed. Mark whispered that he was alone and described the lynx's shallow breaths. Paul's tone shifted slightly, slower, as if to calm him. Help is coming, but it'll take time. Keep her quiet. Do not move her unless she's in danger of colder ground. Mark swallowed, his throat dry, realizing how quickly the temperature was falling. The air was cooling as the sun slid lower, throwing long shadows across the slope. He shifted from foot to foot, unsure what else to do. He gathered dry branches and needles, spreading them gently on the ground near her side, building a layer to block the damp earth. He avoided any direct touch, sliding the materials with a stick. Every few minutes he glanced at her chest, counting the thin rise and fall. Each breath seemed weaker than the last, each one stretching his nerves thinner. His mind raced. How long could she last? Would help arrive in time? He forced himself to stay steady, knowing panic would do no good. Minutes dragged into what felt like hours. The wind picked up, making the pine branches creak like an old house shifting at night. Every noise made him flinch. He kept his eyes fixed on the lynx, afraid that if he looked away, she would stop breathing altogether. Mark tried calling again, pressing the phone tight against his ear, struggling to hold the signal. The ranger's voice cut in and out. If the ground gets colder, you'll need to shift her onto something. Be breathing stable? The words broke, leaving Mark with fragments and static. He looked at the lynx. Her paws twitched weakly, claws scraping the earth in slow motion. She gave a faint sound, barely audible, a raw reminder that she was still fighting. Mark pressed his lips together, fighting the urge to cry out. He knew he had to try. Scanning the slope, he spotted a folded piece of tarp a few yards away, likely dropped by hikers long ago. He scrambled toward it, nearly slipping on the loose soil, then shook off the pine needles before bringing it back. His hands shook so badly that he nearly dropped it. Carefully, Mark spread it out near the lynx. With Paul's fading instructions replaying in his head, he edged the material under her body inch by inch, using sticks for leverage instead of his hands. Sweat broke across his forehead despite the cold. His shoulders burned with effort, every movement deliberate. The lynx let out a hoarse sound, half growl, half moan. Mark froze, heart pounding, whispering apologies though he knew she couldn't understand. He slowed, working gradually, until finally she lay on the tarp, no longer pressed against the freezing soil. Mark sat back on his heels, breathing hard, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the failing animal in front of him. His hands were numb from gripping the sticks so tightly. The forest light dimmed into gray, the outlines of the trees blurring in the dusk. He could see his breath hanging in the air now, each cloud fading into the shadows. The silence pressed down on him, broken only by the lynx's ragged, wheezing breaths. He tried calling again, but the line was gone, no signal. Alone, he listened, shivering, wondering if she would survive until help arrived. He thought of what Paul had said, about keeping her calm, and tried speaking softly into the air, almost like a lullaby. Words meant more for himself than her. Hold on, just hold on, he whispered, repeating it again and again like a rhythm to match her fragile breathing. His legs stiffened from crouching so long, and as he shifted to stretch them, his eyes caught something in the soft earth nearby. Small, delicate prints leading away from the ledge, so much smaller than the paw in front of him. He leaned closer, brushing a pine needle aside. The impressions were fresh, sharp in the moist dirt. His stomach knotted as he traced them with his eyes, realizing how tiny they were. Next to them, a faint tuft of fur snagged on a twig, pale and fine, different from the adult lynx. He stayed frozen, staring, his mind spinning with what this meant. Mark's chest tightened, a heavy weight pressing down on him. This wasn't just one life at risk. She was a mother. Somewhere in the forest, her young were waiting, helpless, and time was running out. The wind shifted, carrying the smell of damp soil and pine resin. Mark wrapped his arms around himself, suddenly aware of how alone he was out here. The thought of small cubs shivering in the underbrush made his heart pound even harder. He glanced back at the lynx, who let out another strained breath, her sides heaving with effort. "They need you," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if the words were for her or for himself. He stared into the fading forest light, realizing the night would not just decide her fate, it could decide theirs as well. By the time headlights cut through the trees, Mark's legs were numb from crouching and his back ached from staying frozen in one position. Relief surged through him as he saw Paul's familiar figure appear, flashlight in one hand, a folded stretcher slung across his back. The ranger moved quickly but carefully, boots crunching across pine needles and loose soil. He stopped only long enough to cast a practiced eye over the lynx, his jaw tightening at the shallow rise of her chest. "She's still alive. Good work keeping her off the ground," Paul said, voice steady but brisk. Without wasting a second, he set the stretcher beside the tarp. "We'll move her together. Slow and even. Don't lift, just slide. We can't risk worsening her injuries." Mark nodded, his palms slick with sweat despite the chill in the air. Together they edged the lynx onto the stretcher. The animal groaned once, claws flexing against the fabric, but she didn't resist. Mark's arms trembled as he clutched the frame, every muscle in his body taut with fear of making a wrong move. Paul adjusted the straps methodically, securing her body while speaking in a calm undertone, as though reassuring both the animal and Mark. Every sound seemed amplified in the stillness. The rustle of straps, the scrape of boots on stone, the low hiss of the lynx's breathing. When they finally lifted, the weight startled Mark. She was heavier than he imagined, her body dense with muscle and fur, a living reminder of wild strength now reduced to vulnerability. Step by painstaking step, they descended the slope, using careful foot placement on the uneven terrain. Their breaths came in sharp bursts of effort, the silence broken only by the forest wind and the stretcher's creak. At last they reached the truck waiting on the dirt road, its metal sides glinting in the beam of the headlights. The drive that followed stretched into a blur of darkness. Fog pockets clung low in the valleys, the headlights cutting narrow tunnels through them. Mark sat rigid, eyes locked on the lynx in the back. He counted each rise and fall of her chest, terrified it might stop. The hum of the tires filled the cab with a steady drone. After several miles of silence, he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I found tracks. Small ones. Cubs." Paul's eyes didn't leave the road. "We'll confirm after she's stable. One thing at a time." His hands were firm on the wheel, but the set of his jaw betrayed tension. Mark said nothing more, but the words sat heavy between them. At the rehabilitation center, bright fluorescent lights replaced the shadows of the forest. A small team rushed to meet them at the doors, led by Dr. Amy Collins. She already wore gloves, her face calm but alert. "Get her on the table. Restraints in place. Oxygen mask ready." Her tone left no space for hesitation. Mark stepped back as trained hands surrounded the animal. The room buzzed with purposeful movement, the kind that came from practiced routine. Amy's voice cut through the noise, directing each step. Within minutes, the lynx was sedated, her body gently arranged for imaging. The scan machine whirred, filling the sterile room with its low hum. Amy leaned over the monitor, eyes sharp as she read the results. She spoke steadily, explaining in simple terms even while focusing on the images. "She's got a fracture in the pelvis, no displacement. Painful, but treatable with rest and restricted movement. There's bruising along the ribs, but no collapse of the lung. That's a good sign. She's lucky." Amy paused, pointing to another detail on the screen. "And she's lactating. She's nursing. That means there are cubs depending on her right now." The words landed like a blow. Mark's mind immediately returned to the tiny prints in the dirt, the tuft of soft fur caught on a twig. His throat felt tight. How long? How long before they can't make it without her? Amy finally turned to meet his eyes. Not long. A week, maybe less. The younger they are, the more vulnerable. Without her warmth and milk, they don't stand a chance. And if we lose them, her recovery will be harder. She'll be restless, agitated. For a moment, the room went silent. Every person present realizing the stakes had doubled. Paul exhaled slowly, running a hand down his face. Then we find them. Tomorrow morning. We move while her scent is still strong. Amy nodded. She'll be stabilized tonight. Pain relief, fluids, oxygen. We'll watch her closely. If she holds steady, you'll search at first light. She looked at Mark. You said you saw tracks. That's where you begin. Cubs hide well, but they don't wander far. Look for cover, rocky cracks, thickets, hollow logs. Mark absorbed every word, his gaze flicking to the lynx lying under the hiss of oxygen. Her chest rose more evenly now, her body finally still. Relief rushed through him, but it was short-lived. The thought of helpless cubs alone in the cold woods pulled him back into tension. He clenched his fists, silently promising himself he wouldn't let them down. Later that night, Paul unrolled a large map across a desk in a dim-side office. His finger traced a wide circle around the ledge where Mark had found her. We'll cover this whole sector. Break it into grids. Ravines, thickets, low brush, anywhere cubs might hide. It'll be slow but thorough. He tapped the paper. There are trail cams nearby. I'll check the footage before dawn. Mark leaned forward, exhaustion heavy in his body but determination in his voice. If they're out there, we'll find them. We have to. Time stretched as they waited. The quiet center hummed faintly with machines and distant voices. When Paul finally returned from the control room, his expression told the story before he spoke. He placed a tablet on the table, pressed play, and the screen filled with grainy footage. The motion-triggered camera had captured two small shapes crossing a clearing at dawn the previous day. Their spotted coats showed even through the poor resolution. Cubs, unmistakable. They hesitated, sniffing the air, one trailing slightly behind the other before both slipped into the undergrowth. Mark's throat tightened as he watched. They were alive. Relief and fear twisted together in his chest. He looked up at Paul, who gave a firm nod. We go after them at first light. No mistakes, no delays. Mark exhaled shakily, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on him. The night felt endless, but morning was already racing toward them. The forest was still dark when Mark and Paul left the center, packs heavy over their shoulders and radios clipped to their jackets. The cold pressed against their faces, biting through fabric. A pale line of dawn stretched across the ridges, a weak promise of light, but the air remained sharp, damp, and heavy with moisture. Their boots sank into moss and patches of frost as they made their way back to the site where Mark had first found the lynx. The woods were hushed except for the crunch of each step and the distant, hollow call of a raven cutting through the valley. Paul stopped at the edge of a ravine, crouching low to study the ground. He ran his gloved finger along a faint impression in the dirt. Tracks are here, he muttered. Mark knelt beside him, peering closer. The prints were tiny, no larger than the palm of his hand, spaced closely together as if the cubs had stuck near each other. He felt a flicker of relief. They were recent, sharp-edged, not blurred by dew or frost. Life had passed this way not long ago. They began to follow the trail, pausing often, careful not to disturb signs. The wind gusted down the ravine, scattering scents and bending brittle branches overhead. Paul frowned. Wind's bad. Makes tracking harder. They'll stay hidden. Mark kept his eyes low, scanning for anything out of place. He found faint scratches on bark, snapped twigs, and once, a tuft of pale fur caught on thorn. Each sign tightened the knot in his chest. They were close, but the cubs were moving, searching for warmth, maybe for their mother. Hours dragged as they worked slowly through thickets and hollows. Sometimes they dropped to their knees to crawl beneath brush, shining flashlights into cramped dark spaces. Their breath puffed white in the cold air, rising and fading instantly. Mark strained his ears at every sound. More than once, he thought he caught a faint whimper, like a kitten crying, but the wind swallowed it before he could be sure. By midday their patience was tested. The forest seemed endless, filled with shadows and silence. Mark's legs ached, and his fingers had gone stiff inside his gloves. They were walking along the rocky base of a slope when Paul suddenly lifted his hand sharply. Listen. Mark froze. He held his breath. At first there was nothing but the moan of the wind. Then, faint but distinct, came a thin, desperate cry. It rose, cut off, then rose again. His heart jolted. Both men turned toward a cluster of boulders where a massive stone slab leaned against the slope, creating a shallow, dark hollow beneath. They approached cautiously, each step deliberate. A loose rock shifted under Mark's boot, clattering noisily down the slope. Dust rained, and the cry from inside quickened, panicked. Mark lowered himself carefully and peered into the shadows. Two small pairs of eyes glowed back at him, reflecting the faint light. The cubs huddled together, fur patchy, their bodies pressed tight as if trying to merge into one. One raised its head with effort, a soft squeak escaping. The other barely stirred, sides moving shallowly. Paul's voice was calm but firm. Slow now? No bare hands. He slid his pack off, unzipping it to pull free two soft cloths and the small carriers lined with blankets. Exactly as Amy had instructed the night before. Mark mirrored his movements, unfolding the cloth carefully, spreading it on the ground at the entrance. They crouched and waited, letting the cubs smell the air and adjust to the new presence. The stronger cub shifted first, inching forward with shaky paws. Paul guided it gently, using the cloth like an extension of his hand, easing it toward the carrier. The cub gave a soft cry, more curious than frightened, then stumbled inside. Paul closed the flap slowly, murmuring under his breath as if the sound might soothe it. The second cub lay still, sides barely moving. Mark whispered, "This one's weaker." He slid the cloth beneath its small frame with infinite care, lifting it into his arms. The cub's eyes flickered open, half closed again, its body trembling. He wrapped it snug, tucking the edges of the fabric to trap warmth, then lowered it into the second carrier. The sound that escaped was faint, almost lost in the wind, but it was enough. Paul zipped the carrier slowly, making sure the fur was clear of the teeth. For a moment, both men just sat there in the silence. The forest seemed to exhale, sounds of creaking branches and distant bird calls seeping back in. Mark's heart thumped hard against his ribs as he stared at the carriers. "They're alive," he said, voice shaking. The hike back felt longer, every step a careful balance. Mark carried the weaker cub, checking often for movement, whispering softly as if words could lend it strength. Paul led, updating the center through the radio, his tone clipped but steady. The sky had dulled to gray, clouds thickening overhead, threatening rain or snow. When they finally reached the truck, both men were exhausted. They loaded the carriers gently, covering them with extra cloths to block drafts. The drive back was silent, every bump on the road making Mark tense, listening for sounds from inside the carriers. The weaker cub whimpered once, then went quiet. Mark pressed his hand against the carrier, needing the reassurance of the small body's warmth. At the facility, Sarah was already waiting. Her calm demeanor steadied them the moment they walked in. She guided them quickly to the prepared enclosure, a box lined with straw, warmed by heat lamps casting a soft glow. "We'll keep them close, but separate until their mother is ready. Stress could do damage." She bent over the weaker cub first, checking its breathing, adjusting the blankets. She glanced at Paul. "This one needs close watch." "Very close." Mark stood back, muscles aching, watching Sarah's careful movements. Though the carriers were now empty, he still felt the weight of them in his arms. Relief flooded him, but it tangled with dread, because he knew the hardest fight was still ahead. Evening shadows lengthened as Amy entered the room. She stripped off her gloves with a grim look. Her temperature's climbing. Likely an infection. "We're starting treatment now. Tonight will be critical." Mark met Paul's eyes, the weight of the day settling heavy between them. The cubs had been saved, at least for now, but their mother's body was faltering. One long night stood between hope and heartbreak, and none of them knew which way it would break. Weeks passed in a rhythm of care and quiet labor. The lynx remained under watch in a secluded enclosure, her body slowly recovering strength. Veterinarians moved with precision, administering antibiotics and fluids, adjusting her diet, monitoring every change. Each day brought small signs of progress, steadier breathing, sharper eyes, the slow return of weight to her frame. The cubs grew in a separate space nearby, sheltered under heat lamps, fed carefully until they gained enough strength to survive on their own. Mark visited often, standing silently near the viewing panel. He kept his distance, not wanting to interfere, but needing to see. Paul stopped by as well, usually with short, practical updates, blood work improving, mobility returning. The facility kept its tone professional, but beneath it all was quiet hope. After weeks of separation, the team planned a first controlled reunion. It began with the cubs placed in a secure pen across from their mother. The lynx, stronger now, rose the moment she saw them. Her ears pricked forward, eyes sharp, a deep sound rolling from her chest. The cubs answered with high-pitched cries, pressing against the barrier. Everyone in the room held their breath. Dr. Amy spoke softly. "We'll keep the barrier for a few minutes. Watch her response. If she shows stress or aggression, we stop." But there was no aggression. The mother paced along the mesh, low sounds vibrating in her throat. The cubs mirrored her movements, desperate to be closer. After 10 careful minutes, Amy nodded. "Let's try supervised contact." Paul and Sarah lifted the barrier slowly. The cubs stumbled forward first, then stopped, sensing the new space. The mother stepped closer, lowering her head. She sniffed each cub, nudging gently. One pressed into her chest with a squeak. The weaker cub hesitated, then leaned into her fur. She curled around them, her body forming a protective curve. The room exhaled as one. Over the next days, supervised sessions continued. Each time, the family bond reformed more clearly. Grooming, play, soft growls of reassurance. Stress markers fell, feeding improved. The cubs no longer whimpered through the night. Finally, when health markers held steady, the decision was made: release. A quiet dawn was chosen, when the forest was still and the air cool. Mark and Paul loaded the carriers with calm efficiency. The lynx wore a light GPS collar, fitted gently by Amy's team. In the dim light, their truck wound through familiar dirt roads back toward the ridges. At the release site, mist hung low, clinging to the pines. The place was close to where she had fallen weeks earlier, chosen so she could return to known ground. Paul set the carrier door against the slope, stepping back. Mark stood beside him, heart tight. The lynx stepped out first, cautious but steady. Her coat had regained its sheen, muscles filled out. She scanned the treeline, ears flicking. The cubs tumbled after her, clumsy but eager, sticking close to her side. She turned once, pressing her nose briefly to each before leading them upward through the brush. For a long moment, the forest was still. Then the family disappeared into the trees, absorbed by the land that was always theirs. Later that day, Mark and Paul returned to the site to set a camera trap. Weeks of work deserved more than a memory. They mounted it discreetly near the ledge, angled toward a natural path. Days later, the footage came through. 3 figures moving through the clearing, mother and cubs climbing steadily toward higher ground. The cubs paused, playing for a moment before chasing after her. Mark watched the clip in silence, then looked out toward the forest line through the window of the center. The image stayed with him: survival, reunion, release. He thought of every step: the night on the slope, the long hours of waiting, the steady hands of the team. What had saved them was not one person, but the chain of decisions, the discipline of care, and the refusal to give up. The forest had taken them back. That was all they had hoped for.